Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is set up a B2C tenant for e-commerce site authentication. My name is Takia, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. By participating in this session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenter or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the session. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Brian Shook, Senior Program Manager. Brian, over to you.
Great, thank you, Takia. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the session today. So we're going to cover configuring the Azure ActiveDirectory B2C in Dynamics 365 Commerce. And again, my name is Brian Shook, a Senior Program Manager on the Dynamics 365 Commerce team. And I'd like to start us off today just by going over the agenda. So first, we'll start with the AAD B2C and Commerce overview. And that'll look at the architectures of both solutions and how they interact together. Next, we'll go into the heart of the presentation, which is setting up your B2C tenant and configuring it in the commerce environment. And then last, I'll end on some additional information that's relevant to the topics we discuss. So with that, let's get started. So what is Azure ActiveDirectory B2C? So AAD B2C is an identity provider which provides end user authentication as a service. So this is an Azure service used to provide the identity management and access management. It stores all the sensitive information of password and username for your user. You can set up an AAD B2C tenant as a resource in your Azure portal, and you can link it to your Azure subscription for costing. So this solution lives in Azure. It's scalable, global, secure, and as an enterprise-ready business-to-consumer identity provider, it was a great fit for partnering with the Dynamics 365 Commerce solution. So let's take a look at how those fit together. So as Dynamics Commerce started, we're using AAD B2C as an out-of-the-box identity provider. That means that B2C is used for the end user, the visitors to your site built in Dynamics Commerce for their authentication purposes. You'd still have a linked customer record in Dynamics that lives in HQ in the channel database, and that's linked to the B2C record for that authentication purpose. So all the main information for the customer is still tracked in Dynamics HQ. Again, we're just using the B2C element for that sensitive authentication portion. So one thing I like to call out and use this diagram as well is that Azure ActiveDirectory B2C is separate from the primary or first-party Azure ActiveDirectory that you may be using for your organization authentication purposes. You'll notice in the diagram, we have the employee using e-commerce site builder or logging in through something like the Dynamics HQ portal. And in those cases, the end backing is an AAD first-party tenant. So that's your organization's tenant for your content. Now, separately as a service, you'll see on the bottom left-hand corner highlighted is the AAD B2C tenant, and it lives as a separate tenant to track end user information. They're not intermingled or co-mixing. So let's take a look at how AAD B2C fits in to both the components of Dynamics as well as the end user pathway when they authenticate. So in today's session, we'll review what we're representing here as the IT admin setting up your AAD B2C information. There's 3 elements they'll be setting up across First is the e-commerce site builder in Dynamics. And that's just configuring information from the B2C tenant to your site configuration information. Secondly, you'll be setting up an HQ as well, so that Dynamics HQ and the channel database have the same information and correlate some of the issuer and other bits of authentication information across these systems. And lastly, we'll have the Azure AD B2C tenant itself, which gets hooked in through configuration, and that's doing the lifting of the authentication work. So we can see this as the left-hand side e-commerce site user comes in from the browser. As they come into the e-commerce storefront, they click the sign in or sign up button, and they're actually redirected to the B2C tenant, which is hosting in its domain pages for that relevant login information. In that hosted page, as they enter their username and password, the call is made to the B2C tenant to authenticate that information. Once authenticated, it returns the token to the user and redirects them back to the e-commerce site so they can continue on their actions. So with these, there's also an element in AAD B2C of social identity providers. So these are records that are stored in the AAD B2C tenant, but they're structured a little differently to link to these social identity providers or an OpenID Connect connection. When configuring in the Azure portal, you can configure for the social identity providers shown here. And there are others, so I do encourage to look at the AAD B2C documentation on how to do this. But importantly, in those instructions, each of these elements may have a different setup path. Typically, you'll have a separate Azure application, and that'll be configured for the social identity provider itself. And you may need something like a Facebook developer account or something of that nature to connect through to your connector from the connector's end. So again, these are unique records in the B2C tenant. And I will call out, the B2C tenant has something called local records too, and those are the direct records stored in the B2C tenant. And that's typically what we'll look through for the rest of this demo of setting up. Now, the AAD B2C tenant ensures uniqueness on the username. And so the email becomes the username and ensures you can't have individuals signing up with the same email, but they're different entities in the system. Now that's different with the social identity provider because it is also issued a record in the B2C tenant, but the email may vary and depend through to the social identity provider itself. So they do get stored as two separate records in the system. And let's take a look at how that flows together. So the setup is virtually the same for the IT admin. You're setting up in the e-commerce site builder, the commerce scale unit or HQ, and you're setting up your B2C tenant. The social identity provider just brings a separate set of instructions for the identity provider using, so you may have to set up that separate application to connect back to B2C. Similarly, when an e-commerce site user comes in from the browser, they click the sign up button for the social identity provider. So a Microsoft sign in button, for example. And if they're going to use their Microsoft account, that redirects to B2C, but then it also redirects to render the page for the social identity provider. They'll enter their information into that, and the authentication comes back to B2C. And once authenticated, that also sends the user redirected back to the e-commerce storefront. So very similar flows on both, just an extra step if you are using a social identity provider. So now let's take a look at the commerce customers and the identity records. And here we'll focus again back on local accounts. The normal flow for an end user, as we said, entering the website and clicking the sign up link, they're redirected to Azure AD B2C. Now, AAD B2C is rendering the sign up form in their domain. And that's where the user inputs their information. And once they verify their email and set their password and click OK, as they authenticate if they are unique in the system, it is redirected back to the e-commerce rendering service, which in turn calls the commerce scale unit with the information. And that token passed creates a new user in Dynamics. So that creates a new customer record that is now linked to the B2C record that was initially created in the earlier part of this step. And that's how you get the flow through from end user into customer record in Dynamics. Now that's default behavior for a new sign up for all local accounts. And again, B2C ensures the uniqueness of the username / the email that they're using for login. Now, the only data shared across both systems or synced across both systems is the first name and last name. So they have what they call a user flow in B2C, which does profile edit. And there we set the claims for the first name or given name and last name or surname. And that's the only occurrence where the data points are synced between both systems. Again, the bulk of the information for the customer will live in HQ moving forward. So another thing I'd like to talk about are custom pages in AAD B2C. So as we talked about the user policy, that's B2C hosting and rendering a page for the form for sign up or the sign in form. B2C has default renderings for those pages that without doing anything will raster on their own. But in Commerce, you can also author in Site Builder pages for those occasions. So in e-commerce Site Builder, as you build a page, you'll use modules, and modules are functional elements within the Dynamics e-commerce system that are bits of action code, typically of JavaScript nature. So as you use the modules and build the page for these custom pages, these are AAD specific pages that you can publish into your endpoint for Commerce and reference them in the AAD B2C tenant for use. And as you do that, as an end user comes into AAD B2C and they're routed to the B2C's domain rendering the page, B2C will pull in the reference of those HTML pages, render the JavaScript, linking to the elements that are the secure form. And then once, of course, authenticated, they redirect the user back to the site. And the benefit of this is you can maintain the branding element of the design of your site that you're building in Dynamics Commerce with these pages that are login specific. Now, I'll also touch later in the additional information on how to brand the default pages a little bit more, but these are typically the routes of using custom pages to help maintain a good quality of site confluence. And we have a few ways to do that with the modules. Starting in 10.0.15, I'll highlight there's now a general AAD module, and we call this the div insert approach. And what that means is there's a specially referenced div that AAD B2C advises when you're using custom pages with their environment. That's the div that B2C inserts all of the sensitive form information and captures securely the input from the user. So we'll look at the general AAD module, but we also have today specific AAD modules, meaning you have sign in, sign up, password reset verification, and the account profile module. All those are linked to specific elements of the page, and we'll review those as well. But again, your third option, though, is to host your own HTML with the div approach as directed by AAD B2C in their documentation. And typically those pages can be, if needed to be hosted separately, can be hosted in Azure Blob Storage or a similar environment. So let's take a little deeper look at the custom page with the AAD generic module in Dynamics e-commerce. With the generic module, you can actually build a single page reference and use it across all the user flows. And that'll make a little more sense in a moment when we go through the user flow setup. But with that page, you'd set up an AAD specific header, an AAD specific footer if you'd like, and have specific elements within the middle be rendered by B2C. And one thing to note that's important is when you have something like the header, it's not reusing the same header if you're using relative links in your e-commerce site. So I'll note that because these pages are being rendered on the B2C domain, the relative links will be broken. And you also have things that you don't want to use, such as cart or things that'll make server calls in the regular header, but from the B2C domain, they would break because they're not connected to the e-commerce environment and served from that environment directly. So things to know, we usually say to build a specific AAD header and footer, and then it's your choice of modules to connect the internal elements for AAD B2C. Now, this generic module is the most dynamic because you can use the single page for a lot of different elements where you're a little more limited with the specific elements in the module set. You can always build your own modules as well and follow the information as it's hosted in the starter kit for e-commerce and use that as an example if you're developing a little further. But the generic module will get a little more mileage for the different pages that B2C will have to render. You can also style with CSS to change the elements look and feel and still create a vibe similar to the website you're hosting. Now let's also look at the AAD specific modules. Again, we noted this is something specific like the sign in module, the sign up module. So they have very specific purposes and you're rebuilding pages with these modules for the suit you need in the user policy we'll look at in AAD B2C. Now, these are designed for a little more functionality in the look and feel. So you can see the positioning can be different. You have a little more leverage in how you author your theme in Dynamics Commerce and how you can position some of the elements within the page. So these are HTML bound JavaScript items that go to the secure elements hosted by B2C. Again, I'll highlight too, as you can see in the image, there's also buttons here for the social identity providers. And if using the specific modules, you'll actually have to do extensibility with the module, with the page itself and the module set to get additional social identity buttons. And those are something that should render in the AAD generic module on its own because B2C is generating into the div. So it's a good highlighted point for how the elements can change. So with that, let's look at setting up the B2C tenant and configuring in Commerce. So when setting up your AAD B2C tenant across the system, there's three elements we'll have open typically. You'll need the Azure portal for your B2C setup and configuration, Dynamics headquarters, and the Dynamics e-commerce site builder. And I like to have those open in three different tabs because it's a little easier to jump around once you have all the information you need. Now, additionally, I advise keeping what I call the resource list, which is just a notepad or word processor where you can keep these data points as you set up across the system. And this is really helpful in the end when you have just a few final data pieces to put into the configuration of Site Builder and or HQ. Now that resource list comprises of the reply URL, which is the pointer to the endpoint for your commerce site. And that's used in the AAD application to redirect users back to your site. You'll need the AAD B2C tenant name, the AAD B2C application ID, which we'll reference as the client ID. You also need the issuer reference, which is referenced throughout the tokens and helps the systems communicate these items when authenticating across each other. And lastly, you'll need three policy IDs that we'll review: the sign up and sign in policy ID, the password reset policy ID, and the profile edit policy ID. So now let's take a look at the first one, the reply URL. So again, the reply URL is your site endpoint. It's the URL generated when you provision your e-commerce environment. And this is the URL you can use to, when you're developing the site, you can use it in a browser and it is a live URL. Now for the reply URL as we're building it, you can go to Lifecycle Services and in LCS, navigate to your environment. From there, click on the section that says Commerce Manage, and the Manage button will launch the action window for the environment. Here you'll see the e-commerce tab, so navigate to that, and the relative links below listed are the e-commerce site, the site builder link, and your asset library link. So copy that e-commerce site link, and that's the site endpoint or URL that we'll need. Now, additionally, when we reference it through this setup, we'll always add a suffix to the end for the reply URL that is /MSDYN365 auth response or auth resp. So that suffix is an indicator to our rendering service in how to redirect information further to your site. So next, we'll start in the Azure portal. And usually you're starting in your main directory where you have your subscription. From there, you can say create a resource. And you'll get the option to search for Azure AD B2C. And when that comes up, click on AAD B2C. And when you hit new to create the tenant, you'll see the options for create a new Azure AD B2C tenant or link to an existing AAD B2C tenant to your Azure subscription. So choose the new option, and you'll see the form to fill out information. You'll see the organization name, which should be the name of your B2C tenant. You'll see the initial domain name, which is the domain they'll utilize to host those pages on the B2C side. An example is typically like our fabricam.onmicrosoft.com, but I believe the default will be the B2C login.com suffix. You then set your country or region, and you have an opportunity to add your subscription here. And you can also add a resource group or choose to create a new resource group if needed. Now, if you've created the new tenant, it will provision and then let you know that the tenant provisioning is completed. And when that's done, it usually redirects to that create a B2C tenant. Now, if you didn't link your subscription to that tenant, you do have an opportunity to navigate back to your main directory in Azure portal and go through the same process as though you're going to create a new B2C tenant. Hit create a resource, select B2C, and then when you have that same option to create a new one or link an existing, you can use that link an existing AAD B2C tenant to link it to your Azure subscription. So now let's create the application within the B2C tenant. Here you'd make sure you change your directory so that you're in the newly created AAD B2C tenant. Now search for Azure AD B2C page to bring up the full blade for AAD B2C. And you'll see in the menu items the section App Registrations. Here, click on that App Registrations and select New Registration. You'll be presented with a form to fill out for the information for the application. Now name your application, and that's a name of your choice. And then you'll see the supported account types. And choosing the bottom option, which is the option showing accounts in an identity provider or organizational directory. And you'll see in parentheses for authenticating users with user flows. And that's what we want for the commerce system. You can then set the redirect URI, which is the reply URL from your resource list. So set that to web as type, and then include the reply URL, which is your endpoint URL plus the MS-DYNE 365/auth response suffix. And I also leave the permissions for grant admin consent to OpenID and offline access permissions selected. So at this point, click register to create your AAD B2C application. And this is the application that the systems will use to talk together. So Dynamics Commerce will be calling through this application when interacting with your tenant. So selecting back into your application after it's created, you'll see a section called Authentication. So navigate to that, and here you'll see the area to add a platform. And if it's not showing, go ahead and add the web platform. But normally in the provisioning, if you've done the original setup that we discussed, it should show, and you'll see the listed redirect URI to show your reply URL. Now this is an area too where you can come back and add additional reply URLs. There is a set limit or a max of how many you can enter, but you can enter a few. And typically, if you're using this AAD B2C tenant for 1 or 2 sites, you won't hit that limit easily. But you have your endpoint reply URL set up. You can also take the opportunity to set up a reply URL for your production domain. So if my production domain was going to be www.fabricam.com when I go live with my site, I could include that here with the MS-DYNE 365/auth response suffix. Now, importantly, you'll see the section that says implicit grant. And here you just want to make sure that both access tokens and ID tokens are selected. Now, once you've made those changes, hit save to save your change. And then navigate to the overview within the application. The overview gives all the information for this application, and importantly, we'll grab the application ID or the client ID. So copy this value, and it's a GUID value, and add that to your resource list for later reference. You also see the redirect URIs section, which you can click in, and that's where you can configure additional reply URLs too. It's another means to get there. Now, I do want to take a quick moment and talk about user attributes. So these are actually back in the tenant layer of your AAD B2C page. You can set up user attributes in addition to what's already there. Now, this is a good feature in the sense that in commerce, we are adding the ability to add custom attributes for the customer. And it's in line with the solution that exists today where you can add custom attributes in HQ, have them associated to the customer and show up in the POS system or the point of sale system. Those same custom attributes now can be named specifically to something you set up as a user attribute in your B2C tenant. And through the name matching and the data type matching, the rendering service in commerce will connect those values at the initial sign up. Now that is a one-way data flow. And I do want to highlight that B2C supports string, Boolean, and integer. And so when setting up custom attributes in Dynamics, you'll likely want to keep the same data type relevant as well. But this is a means to collect some of the additional information other than the email, first and last name that are typical in a commerce setup. So let's talk about user flows. Now, user flows in the AAD B2C provide the functionality to control the specific user actions. This is what the end users interact with to do their authentication means. And there's three common ones we use in the Dynamics commerce and setup: the sign up and sign in, profile edit, and password reset. Sign up and sign in is a combined user flow that presents the sign in information on the page as well as a link to the sign up. And if users click that sign up link, they're still in the same user flow policy, but they can perform the sign up in a different page layout. Now, profile edit, again, is a simplified form just for first name and last name, and that's utilized to sync those bits of information across both systems. And lastly, there's the password reset, which is a self-service password reset user flow. And when a user enters their email address, they can send a secure PIN in email to that email address. And once verifying in the system, it will grant the ability to reset the password. So let's review setting up these three different user flows. First, I like to start with the sign up and sign in. So navigate to the user policies menu item and select create a user flow. Here you have an option to choose which user flow you're setting up. So I choose sign up and sign in, and then I choose the recommended version, which is typically the latest version. Once you hit create, you'll provide a name for the user flow. And you'll see that name is always prefixed with the B2C_1_ prefix. Now, capturing that prefix with the name you provide is actually capturing the policy ID for this user flow. So you want to capture that for your resource list. Now, once you provide a name, if you have identity providers selected as well in the tenant, you can add them under the local accounts section. You'll see additional identity providers. But again, for our purposes, the common action is to stick with the local accounts and just select email sign up under local accounts. Now, within the policy itself, you can alter additional information. There's information about the token, the multi-factor authentication, And those configurations you can change as it meets your business security needs. But for these setups, the defaults are typically used in our environments. So once you're going through the creation of the sign up and sign in, you also see a section for collect attributes and return claims. And you'll need to click the show more button that's underneath to show the full list. When you click show more, an action list shows up to the right. And for sign up and sign in, you'll go through the collect attributes and select email address, given name, and surname. Additionally, in the return claim section, select the email addresses, given name, identity provider, the surname, and the user's object ID. When you're done, hit OK, and then click Create to create the user policy. So as your policy is created, it'll show up in the list of all your policies. And once you're redirected to that page, click back into your sign up and sign in policy. Now, if you want to set the policy up with the custom pages as we described, here's the opportunity to do so. Navigate to the Properties menu, and you'll see the button for Enable JavaScript Enforcing Page Layout. You want to make sure that's set to on. Click Save once changed, and then we're going to navigate to the page layouts. Now, page layouts is where you can control how the pages interact, the custom page that's referenced for the user policy page layout. And we're going to start with the unified sign up or sign in page selected. So with that selected, you'll see the additional information below to configure that specific page layout. And this is really the sign in layout. So below, I'll select Use Custom Page Content to Yes. And then I'll add my endpoint URL. And if I'm using the same pages as were built in the starter kit and starter site, when you provisioned your e-commerce environment, I'm going to use the typical URL name, which is sign-in. Now, for all these page layouts, when you're using the custom page from the e-commerce site, add the argument in the URL, preload scripts equals true. Finally, select the page layout version that you'll be using, and I'm typically selecting the latest one available. Once done, hit Save to save those changes, and then click below on the local account sign up page. Now, this is the direct page form for the sign up properties. So with that selected, you can select Use Custom Page to Yes on the menu item below. And again, use your endpoint to set the custom page URI, but this time using the sign-up page. And just a note, when you're in Dynamics e-commerce site builder has the page reference and the URL reference tied, so you can see which URL is being used for your particular page, just in case you've made changes. Again, we'll use that suffix preload scripts equals true so that that argument is attached to the URL, and we'll set the page layout version. Now with the sign up page, here's where you see the user attributes section, because these user attributes are associated with the sign up portion of the flow. Now here we have email address, given name, and surname as user attributes selected. Make sure the optional is set to no for those three, because you'll need those all to be required fields for interacting with Dynamics Commerce. And then on the email address under requires verification, leave that set to the default, which is yes, because that ensures when a new user comes to the site and provides an email address, they'll receive a 6-digit security PIN in email, and that way they verify that they own the email that they're signing up with. You also notice to the right, you can change the label here in the user policy. And so if using similarly the generic AAD module, if you wanted to name this something else, this is a method to do it through the label. So once you've made those changes, hit save, and we're done with the sign up and sign in module. Now we'll do a create new user flow for the password reset. When you select create the new user flow, select password reset, and then set the recommended version. Again, provide this policy a name, and it will be prefixed with the B2C _1 _. and then set the local accounts option for reset password using email address. Again, you'll want to note the name that you utilized for your user policy for password reset, so copy that to your resource list. Now, as you're setting up the user policy, again, click Show More on the Return Claims section. And there's only return claims for password reset, but you'll see the action menu open. And here, select email addresses, given name, surname, and user's object ID. Then hit OK and select Create. Now again, if you're using the custom page, go back and select into this user policy. And under Properties, switch that Enable JavaScript Enforcing to True or On, and save that change. Now you can navigate to the page layout section, and we'll start with the change password page. So again, set the use custom page content to yes, and then with your endpoint URL, typically you'll use the page password-reset with the preload scripts equals true. Now you can set the page layout version and hit save, and now go up to the forget password page. In forget password, set the use custom page content to yes, and then add your page URL, this time with the URL with the password-reset-verification. And set the page layout again and hit save. And just a reminder, if you're using the generic AAD module, it'll be the same URL that you're using for all these different setups. You won't need the specific password reset verification, for example. Both these pages can reference the same end page that you name when you build it in Site Builder. So save those changes, and you've built the password reset policy. And lastly, let's do the profile edit policy. So back in the AAD B2C blade, under user flows, click create a new user flow, select profile editing, and click the recommended option. Again, name your profile edit policy and store that name in your resource list. Under identity providers, make sure the local account section with local account sign-ins is selected. And then under the attributes and return claims, select the show more option. In the action menu that opens, for collect attributes, select given name and surname. And for the return claim, select email addresses, given name, identity provider, surname, and user's object ID. Click OK and select Create to create the user flow. Again, for custom page, let's go back to Properties, set the Enable JavaScript Enforcing Page Layout to On and save, and then navigate to Page Layouts. And here you'll select the Profile Edit page. Set the custom page content to yes, and you can use a custom page URL. And if using the specific modules, the profile-edit page with the preload scripts equals true. Once you set the page layout version, here again, you'll see the user attributes. And for profile edit, again, we want to make sure these are required. And so for given name and surname, optional should equal no. So with those changes, hit save. And now we can move on to retrieving the issuer reference. So while you're in your Azure AD B2C portal, click on your sign up or sign in policy or one of your policies. You'll see the action menu when you click in with a button that says Run User Flow up the top menu. Select that Run User Flow action. And again, you'll see another action menu swipe from the right. And under the label that says Run User Flow, you'll see a URL, and that URL will take you to the configuration page for this application and the sign up policy. The URL typically ends in /openid-configuration with the argument of the name of your user policy. As you click it, it should open in a new tab or window. And the first item you'll see is the issuer item. So as you find that issuer value, select in between the parentheses to grab the entire URL value. And it's usually ending in the v2.0/. We also have additional instructions on our documentation for building the URL to build that page if needed. Great, so with that, let's just check in on our resource list. So now we should have all the information we need to do the final configuration pieces, which should make it pretty quick. Again, we collected the reply URL. We have the AAD B2C tenant name. And I wanted to highlight, you've provided the tenant name when you provision, but if you need to reference it later, you can actually go into the directory, and it should be listed as the directory name as well. You'll also see it prefixed before your b2c.login.com domain. It's the first part leading up to the period. So there's multiple ways to reference that tenant name. We've also collected the AAD B2C application ID or the client ID. We just collected the issuer reference. And then we have our different policy IDs as we created those different user flows. So now we can navigate to Dynamics HQ and do that configuration for this B2C tenant. So here, simply go to the Commerce Shared Parameters and then go to the Identity Provider screen. You'll see under Identity Providers, you'll enter that issuer string when you click Add for the new identity provider. You can provide a name of your choice. And then under Type, make sure you select the Azure AD B2C with the ID token in parentheses. So with that line still selected, you'll look down to the relying parties underneath. Here's where you enter the client ID and set the type to public and the user type to customer. And with those in place, hit save. And now you want to run the 1110 global configuration distribution schedule. That'll make sure the changes sync across your databases. You can now navigate to Site Builder, and we'll do the final piece of the configuration. So in Site Builder, you want to start at the home screen. And I like to point out the home screen is the blue grid on the top left corner of the page in the Site Builder portal. When you click that grid, you'll see the home drop-down option. So as you navigate to home, you'll see the menu item for sites and tenant settings, and you want to select the tenant settings to drop that down. Underneath, you'll see the B2C settings, and here's where we'll set up our application. So click Manage under the B2C application section. And again, you'll see an action menus come from the right and pop up with a window to add your application information that we've collected. So fill these fields out appropriately with the data we have. Now, application name is a name you can choose, and you'll reference it when you do the channel binding in the next step. So it's for your reference using within Site Builder. Add your tenant name, the forget password policy ID, the client GUID, and the edit profile policy ID, and lastly, the sign up and sign in policy ID. And those required fields are really all you need when doing a configuration. One option that might come into play is the login custom domain. And that's if you're using or have set up a custom domain with your B2C tenant. So it replaces that B2C login.com URL that B2C is rendering. If you have a custom domain in that place, you can add it here as well. So once everything's entered, click OK. And the system will attempt to validate to make sure that the policy IDs that you're referencing do belong to the tenant, that the tenant name is a tenant name it's found. And so some basic validation will try to help make sure you have the right information in case there's the potential for a mistake. Now, lastly, we'll just connect that application we set into the configuration for Site Builder to the channel of the site you're working. And these are just the site configurations that e-commerce Site Builder is using as you build your page. I want to make sure these configs are lined up. So from the home menu where you just closed and saved the changes you made, and I will call out too, as you fill out the information, do be sure to save so you don't lose this when you hit OK. There'll be a separate save button to click. So you can now navigate to your site in Site Builder under the Sites section. And once in the Sites menu, you'll see below at the left-hand side, Site Settings. So drop that down and click on the Channels section. You'll get an action menu again on the right-hand side once you click into the name of the channel that you're affecting. And as you click into that name and see the action, you'll see the Select B2C Application dropdown. And that, when dropped down, will show you the name that you chose when you set up the configuration in the previous step. So select that name, hit OK, or close the action menu, and then hit Save and Publish. Now, a quick note on default behavior. If in your e-commerce environment in Site Builder, you've set up the B2C application, the first one that you configure, if you don't do any setting to these different channels as you start to work with them, it'll use that first option as a default. So I actually like to advise that for each channel you're working, when you do the initial site setup, make sure you go in and dedicate the specific B2C application that you want to use for that site. It's especially important if you have multiple sites you're managing throughout Site Builder to make sure that that site's always dedicated to the right endpoints and the right B2C tenant. So once that's completed, you're done with setup. And now it's a good time to go test that the sign-in and the user policies are working as expected. So now you can navigate in the browser to your site endpoint, the URL that is hosting your site. You'll click the sign-in link, and the site should redirect you to the B2C endpoint for your B2C tenant. And if you've set up custom pages, you should see the custom pages rendering for the form information for sign in, sign up, or forget password flows. Now, once you sign up for the first time or subsequently sign in, as you're authenticated, you'll be redirected back to the e-commerce site. And you want to make sure that's working appropriately as well. Additionally, a good indicator is once you've returned back to the site and you're logged in, you should see your name if you're using the default modules that ship with Store Starter Kit within our module library. You'll see a name indicated on the login section. So also don't forget to go test the forget password flow and make sure those page states are working as expected, as well as the edit profile flow, which is found when you go to My Account and Edit Profile. So let's take a moment as well to talk about a few troubleshooting tips for some common items that we see. So the behavior you might see as an issue is you click sign in and you're not redirected to the B2C domain. If that happens, commonly you can check the reply URL as configured in the B2C application to make sure there wasn't a mistake or an issue there. Otherwise, double check your Site Builder tenant settings when you set up the B2C application in Site Builder. And if there is an issue there, it may show a warning, or just make sure that the references you have set are what you intended. And another common issue is you're redirected to B2C, you authenticate appropriately, but now when you're redirected back to the site, you see some retry happening, or you don't see your name in the logged in section up above. So it looks like you're not actually logged in. If that's the case, check the Dynamics HQ setup, as that's commonly an issue with the commerce shared parameters and the identity provider section that we filled out. And lastly, if you're directed to B2C and the custom pages you're using just aren't rendering properly, first step to check would be that making sure that Enable JavaScript button was set to yes and that save occurred. And those are the common items we see with the configuration setup. But normally it's a pretty smooth process. And so let's talk about a few points of additional information with B2C and commerce. The first one I want to talk about are the post-launch updates. So this is the moment where you've built your e-commerce site in Dynamics Commerce, and now you're going live with your production domain. You're making the DNS switch so that live production traffic will now flow to your new site. So something to consider is A, making sure that the B2C application has that reply URL with your production domain, including the MS-DYNE 365 auth response suffix. Also, just after launch, you may want to update the page layout URLs you used for those custom pages to reflect the production domain. Make sure you include the preload equals true argument when you update those elements. And lastly, it's always good to test all the flows before launch and after launch, just to make sure everything's working as expected, as logging in is a very important factor for all e-commerce sites. So those are big elements you want to make sure work as you intend. Now, I noted earlier on the default rendering that B2C has to render the sign-up form or the different forms per the user policy. And within the B2C tenant, you can set up the company branding in the company branding menu to reflect a logo, a sign-up page picture, and define a color as well that's common in the theme. So though B2C is doing the rendering, these are a few elements you can control through this company branding section. So I like to actually navigate to my B2C directory and then go to the Azure ActiveDirectory blade, not the normal AAD B2C page. And within the AAD blade itself, go to the company branding there, and I set up there. You can set a default, but you can also do per language brandings. And an important note is this is a per tenant setting. So per your B2C tenant, this company branding will persist. And that's something to be aware of. If you're hosting multiple sites with their own branding and one B2C, you may want to split that to different B2C tenants and set up the company branding appropriately. What this will affect are the additional pages that B2C may have to render if there's multi-factor or something different that's not within the custom pages that were set up. And this is a good cause too to look at the AAD general module because it has a little more dynamic capability with those type of pages as well. But the company branding also shows on the sender email when a user is doing the sign up flow or the forget password flow and gets that secure PIN sent in email. The logo attached can render through with that email, so it represents your company. So I also want to touch on how do we get more complex or get more specific beyond what's built into the user policies through the portal. And in the Azure portal, you can work with what's called custom policies in B2C. So go to their Identity Experience Framework menu item in the B2C blade. There you'll see links to additional documentation. You can download samples, and you'll see a lot of information around custom policies. So they're a little more complex, but allows you to do more than might be needed in the built-in policies themselves. And lastly, I want to touch on user migration, as this is a big topic as well when you're migrating from another identity provider to AAD B2C. And AAD B2C documentation goes through a few different suggested methods to look at. So what I wanted to highlight here is just plan early in terms of architecture migration, execution, because these will factor into your approach and how you want to execute this whole operation. And you can review the approaches with the AAD B2C team or the Dynamics Commerce teams for open questions, and that helps you ahead of time too to prepare. You can also reach out to Dynamics Commerce. We can provide a sample utility for using Graph API, which is a common method to input data into the B2C tenant. And lastly, I'll just note that since you're dealing with account information, at the very least emails with a migration, you'll want to have the highest security of your migration process in place. So keep that in mind. And with that, that concludes our session of setting up an AAD B2C tenant in Dynamics Commerce. And I'll hand it back over to you, Takia.
Thank you, Brian. We would like to get your feedback on today's session. I have posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome your input on how we did today and what you would like to see in future sessions. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. Thank you for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Brian, and a thank you to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.